Jaques of Carbuncle Animation. Bob, along with Kelly Armstrong, I would say, were responsible for some of the show's most jaw-droppingly brilliant animated sequences. And if you enjoy yourself some fantastic 2D animation and want to treat yourself, look up Bob Jaques Animation. Jaques is spelled Jaques, as well as Kelly Armstrong Animation. The video's on YouTube. Someone's compiled an assortment of isolated shots that they took on, and if you're familiar with the show, I guarantee there'll be a lot of your favorite moments in there, and certainly the ones that linger in memory as being above and beyond what anyone would expect to see in a TV show, especially at the time. Carbuncle, they were a big part of visualizing Ren and Stimpy during the Spumco years, and they stuck around to finish their work on the remaining episodes after John K. had been removed. And I would say that if I were to pinpoint one regret or issue I have about the game's era of the show, which, as I've said, I do still find hugely impressive for a multitude of reasons, it would be the absence, I suppose, of what Bob and Kelly brought to the table. Bob's working relationship with John also goes back pretty far to their time at Bakshi Productions, and let's have Bob take it from there. So, as far as like the Ren and Stimpy show, when that sort of came along, you'd had a bit of prior work alongside John and Ralph and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so one early project would have been the Harlem Shuffle video for the Rolling Stones, right?
Yeah, and I think the album had just come out previous to that, and John had done the cover art for that, and then so I guess Ralph had struck a deal where he could do a video to accompany the release of the album. Single, I mean. I don't think there was an album.
Yeah, I actually saw it quite recently again at Annecy. They played a sort of retrospective of John K. projects and a sort of... he did a little presentation there, and so they had a bunch of little clips of stuff that he'd worked on before, sort of over the years. It was interesting.
What did he show from Mighty Mouse? Or did he show anything?
He showed the Alvin and the Chipmunks parody one. Definitely there was a quality about that one, watching it now. Like, you could see the seeds were being sown for what was to come.
Well, John likes to describe Mighty Mouse as a template for Ren and Stimpy. It kind of worked out the bugs, or tried to work out the bugs in Mighty Mouse. There was a lot of problems, one being that you were sending these really lively drawings that demanded animation to an animation studio that really didn't know how to handle them. And that's one of the things with working with John's layouts and drawings is there's a certain amount of life they demand. And so when we got to Ren and Stimpy, in fact, when he first called me about Ren and Stimpy and he started sending us layouts and stuff, he went, look, this is going to be exactly like Hanna-Barbera, and you can expose it on 8s and just make it really limited. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, why? You've got these drawings that are just packed with energy and they demand to be animated. So me and Kelly just went ahead and did our thing. And I think there's only a couple of scenes where they actually did stuff on 8s or exposed stuff on 8s. I know one scene in particular where they're looking up to the sky and their pupils are growing big. But that's the only one I can think of where he actually worked to that specification.
Certainly the quality that seemed very familiar was the very, very well-timed dynamic sort of pose-to-pose animation.
Yeah.
That really kind of helped carry the story and the emotion across. And that I definitely, see as like a sort of template for what would later be expanded on. But, certainly in that sort of first year or so of Ren and Stimpy, there was a lot of similar visual stuff going on there.
Well, in the early days of sort of sending work overseas, it was almost like you set things into a formula because you knew that they could follow that formula. And if you tried anything outside of that sort of what you knew you were going to get back, there was an air of danger about it because, it could be subject to retakes. And I know there's a lot of studios that put a cap on the number of retakes. So if you stray too far and you get a show that comes back and it's a disaster, it's the old fix it and post thing.
So from that sort of point on, when that show sort of reached its conclusion, what was the sort of journey from your perspective from that to Ren and Stimpy? Do you know if that was an idea John had for a while, or whether it was something that was sort of purposefully developed for Nickelodeon?
No, 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 no. He had been trying to shop a lot of ideas around for years, and then I think it was they got a meeting with Vanessa Coffey, and she picked Ren and Stimpy out of the group,
Hmm.
and wanted to make that into a series.
So you were involved in the that first pilot short, Big House Blues.
Right, right.
It was a pretty visually groundbreaking show in many respects, aside from the sort of foundations that had been laid with Mighty Mouse. Compared to other shows you'd worked on before then, was it like was it a very new thing to be working on as far as television was concerned?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Well, the one great thing about working with John on Ren and Stimpy was there were very few limitations. There were certain disciplines that you had to stick to, but he wouldn't say, no, you can't put this on ones. No, you can't use 10 drawings or whatever. You can't use secondary action. He didn't put any restrictions on that. The only thing was well, he would pitch, generally speaking, when we were doing a show, at least in the first season, he would call me up and pitch the show to me, and I'd write notes what he was looking for in particular, and then I would go and time the thing, and then I would pitch it to the animator, and they'd get the layouts and the timing, and they would work with that.
Mm-hmm. And was that process sort of carried through to the series once it was picked up?
Well, with the pilot, John looked after all the pre-production stuff, and we just animated. But when the series started, that's when I started timing the animation for in-house use. And I did some shows that went elsewhere too. At the beginning of the season, I went down to California and helped them start up. So I worked on a lot of episodes I was never credited on, but I didn't do a ton of stuff in those episodes, kind of just getting it kick-started so that we could start. It was all contingent on getting enough work together so that we could start in Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
But we started using animatics in the second season, which were kind of because I think the first one was made on an Atari computer, if I recall correctly. But they were kind of like guidelines. They weren't locked down. Like today, when I get an animatic, they're pretty much locked down, and then I can shuffle things a bit, but I don't have a lot of leeway. In Ren and Stimpy, if I wanted to open something up, it wasn't a problem. I could take as much time as I wanted to, and then John would deal with it on his end. But the whole point was to make it work, and then whatever extra footage or whatever needed to be edited would be looked after by John.
Mm-hmm. When John was gone from the show, was that around the time you guys stopped working on it as well?
No, we finished out our contract,
Mm-hmm.
and that took us into Royal Canadian Kilted Yaxman.
Uh-huh.
And we did a Powdered Toast Man short that went with that episode. And when it switched over to games, I think it was partway through Son of Stimpy.
Right. Okay.
That's the last one I actually worked with John
Mm-hmm.
on. And then with Kilted Yaxman, they just handed it to me and they said, just do it.
Uh-huh.
Pretty much. Even though, Chris Riccardi was the actual director on it.
Certainly, it looks like that last crop of shows were absolutely some of the most sort of visually well done episodes of Ren and Stimpy, and there was definitely I think a zenith as far as the overall visual quality. Like Kilted Yaxman, I remember there are sequences in that are pretty much like cinematic animation. It's really, and Son of Stimpy as well. Like
Yeah.
it was a really, for a Saturday morning cartoon, which I believe is what it was in the States. It's really quite pushing the envelope in a lot of respects. From your sort of memories of as an animator, were there any sort of like animation highlights or like shots or episodes that kind of stick in your memory as ones you're particularly fond of or proud of?
Sort of the iconic ones that when George Licker gets hit in the head with the oar, the raging bull shot. Geez, a lot of the iconic ones I think are, like Stay Put Socks. That was first season though.
Mm-hmm.
Just to backtrack a bit, when we started the first season, I remember we tried to cut back a bit in the animation because the deadlines were pretty tight, and we were trying to take it a step back because we weren't sure how we would be able to handle like a series, like the flow of the series anime. Like we got a long time to do the pilot. And then the second season, we stepped it up. We brought in some more animators and we stepped it up a bit. But not to say there's not a lot of good animation in the first season. I think it was just simpler. And plus, we had Phil Cartoons working against us. There was a lot of animation. Like it's hard for me to look at Space Madness now because it was so screwed up in camera. It wasn't painted right. Stuff wasn't shot. There was animation went completely missing, stuff like that. And then for the second season, they started to do the digital ink and paint and camera in California, which made it much better. There were a lot less mistakes from that end of things. So it went a lot smoother.
Hmm. Each season of the show kind of has its own visual personality in a way. Like, it's one of those shows, even though toward the end, especially in the games era, like shows could look different from episode to episode in quite a major way. But certainly as far as like the economics of the later episodes and then that kind of slick look to the second season and what you just sort of described with that first season, there was a certain rawness to that. It's one of those shows where you could sort of identify which period you're watching almost on sight, which I always quite liked about it in a way.
Yeah, I remember that we weren't absolutely sure what was going to happen. When we started Kill the Jacksman, I said to everybody, well, let's just go for broke. Let's make this our swan song and let's just do a really, really super job and to the best of our abilities. And I think it turned out really great, personally.
Mm-hmm. It remains just really, really great to look at.
Yeah.
And sort of go through like sort of shots from, like I still use sort of scenes from Ren and Stimpy as like reference material for like, if I'm trying to get a handle on a character behavior or things like that. And just the ways that certain performances were sort of put across in that style, but in a very kind of real, sort of engaging way. They're tremendous like studies for people who are working in 2D animation. Definitely.
It was like being in school every day, a great sort of school. It's like you get these layouts and they look like they come from two different worlds and you go, how am I going to make these work? And it was a lot of problem solving, trying to get it and not look bizarre, like not making the characters melt or morph into these weird expressions and stuff like that. So it was really great from that standpoint. After working on a show like that, you get a huge animation vocabulary. So when you go elsewhere, you go, oh yeah, I've got to get from this pose to this pose. How can I do it the most economically and the best way to do it?
Hmm. And that again, I think, is a really valuable lesson that people can take from it if budgets are tight, and as they often are.
Well, I think one of the things I tried to focus on when we were working on Ren and Stimpy was trying to get the biggest bang for your buck. And I know a lot of people go, wow, there's so much animation, it looks full, but it's not really. It's like where you put it. Like we'd have Stimpy zip into a scene, but then the secondary action on a hair, you do maybe, 6 drawings or whatever of hair, but it makes it look really lush.
One thing I also really love, some guy has done maybe there are a few of these, but I saw some guy had done a blog where he's just putting up screen grabs of smears.
Yes.
Like those sort of smear tweens, and I those are really great. And it's sort of weird how, looking through those, how much I smear, if I'm called upon to do like a shot like that, I'll have sort of subconsciously or subliminally picked up on, like, because my smears are just really similar to like Ren and Stimpy smears for some reason.
Yeah, I think we used every type of speed trick in the book. Smears, multiple images, stuff like that. It's fun though when you have a huge vocabulary of animation techniques and you can use them. You can have your cake and eat it too. All of a sudden, everything got that much better.
While it was very different, I mean, I remain quite fond of, I would say, the greater percentage of the games era shows. I do feel like the last season was a bit rough.
Yeah.
But the third and fourth season, I actually feel there's quite a lot of strong stuff in there. And I'd be sort of curious, because I guess around that point, you had moved on. But did you ever sort of see much of the games era episodes?
Yeah, I think I've seen most of them. I stayed in contact with some of the games people, but I mean, there's a select number of ones that I really thought were great, just off the top of my head, and hopefully anybody from games that's listening to this isn't going to be offended. But I thought Mike's short, Ren's Brain, Chris Riccardi's, and especially, strangely enough, Reverend Jaques.
Yeah. That's that's one that definitely, because that was just sort of bewildering at the time when I would have seen it, and then with the backstory.
Yes, I was just about to say, if you know the backstory and the references, it's very entertaining.
I saw the at some point there was like the deleted scenes from that one surfaced, which was like a really really specific, like like putting meat on John Kricfalusi's head, and like
yeah, you read the story about that in Sick Little Monkeys, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's one of my moments. But it was good. I got a good. Jim Gomez sent me a uncut version of it. So I've never seen an edited version of it, so I don't know what they cut.
I got this very hacked up version of Ren and Stimpy the first time around. They showed it on BBC Two here.
Yeah.
And I guess it was an awkward time slot. They'd show it. It was weird. They'd show it on like a Tuesday at 6 in the evening, like when kids would be having like dinner.
Yeah.
And I think they had to wedge it in between shows, so they would inevitably cut out at least a minute per 20-minute block. So quite a lot of stuff I never actually saw until I got like DVDs. But then the DVDs would cut out other scenes.
Yeah, I think Out West has been hacked. Fortunately, I got complete versions of at least all the ones that we animated. And I think Out West and Kilty Jacksman, there was they bleeped out the word hell. They crossed it out or fogged it out or whatever and bleeped the word hell. Mm-hmm. They cut a couple scenes out of Sven Hoek. I'm not sure whether they originally aired that way, or I think there's like 3 versions of Sven Hoek, so I'm not sure what one actually aired.
Yeah, I definitely have seen 2 versions. One that aired, and the other that was on like VHS at the time, and then I guess it's later on DVD. And definitely there's a version with completely different music.
Yeah, there's a version we usually call it the bloated version. John tried to expand it to 22 minutes, and I think it's been circulating on the internet. And then it came back, Vanessa asked me to cut it, and I said, no, thanks. I'm not, that's John's job. I'm not disrespecting him by doing that. And so I think it fell back into Bob's hands, and he cut it. But it's not the version that we delivered, because everything was like, if there was an 8-frame pause, it was made, 2 or 3 times as long. So I noticed the last time I watched Van Hoek, I go, that doesn't look right. And then, checking with pencil tests and stuff like that, I found out that it didn't actually go back to the original version.
It's I probably wouldn't have noticed as a kid, but probably now I think I'd probably pick it up on it. Because certainly timing is a major issue with that kind of thing. And something that I also felt is one of the things that really kind of differentiates between perhaps the games era is that the episodes moved along at a very different sort of clip. And I felt like the Spumco episode sort of had more breathing room, maybe.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you an interesting story about that when that started to happen, because the first season, when I time stuff, I timed it pretty tightly with some room for editing. You got to give handles and wiggle room and stuff like that, just in case something doesn't work out. But I went down at the beginning of the second season to help kickstart it again. So I was working on Man's Best Friend, and I was timing stuff, and it would get shot in an animatic form, and John would look at it and say, too fast. I go, oh, okay. And so I take it back and retime it again. Too fast. Take it back, retime it again. Too fast. So this is actually when that sort of prolonged pauses started. And then once I saw Man's Best Friend, it made sense to me. It was like, and particularly in Man's Best Friend, it was like this torture, like when your dad stares you down and there's this kind of awkward silence I think it worked particularly well for Man's Best Friend. I'm not sure it worked for the other episodes, but